The President of the Fiji Indigenous Business Council, and Sir and Lady of Morgan, our invited guests from the Solomon Islands and other countries, the MC, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the invitation here. As you know, the Prime Minister was to be here this morning. Unfortunately, he could not be here as he's in Laos at the moment doing a tour of Laos. What is really interesting about this forum, there are two aspects of it. One of them is particularly, which we are keen about, is the extension of Fijian businesses or potential of Fijian businesses to go into the Melanesian countries. And I'd like to start off with that. As you know, the Melanesian Spearhead Group also had the Melanesian Trade Agreement. Now, this trade agreement, in fact, was very, very skewed in the sense that Fiji was the only country that was allowing goods from other countries in the Melanesian group to come into Fiji duty-free. And that had continued for quite a period of time. And indeed, there were some fairly indiscriminate quarantine requirements that were also placed on Fijian goods entering into Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. Let me give you some statistics. In 2000, Fiji's total trade with the MSG region was insignificant, less than 0.5% of the total trade. However, in 2012, MSG trade accounted for approximately 3 to 4% of Fiji's total trade, and 36% of Fiji's trade with the Pacific Island countries. So it's grown quite significantly, in fact, many-fold. Now, what actually happened in September 2012, which is very, very significant, Papua New Guinea, which is the biggest MSG country, its population is nearly 8 million people, larger than New Zealand, probably twice the size of New Zealand. Enormous wealth in terms of minerals, and a lot of untapped economic potential and growing at a very good rate based on the economic exploitation, removed all import duties from over 400 different items. So in other words, Fiji and Fijian products and Fijian businesses could in fact send their goods into Papua New Guinea completely duty-free, except sugar, tin fish, and salt. The three things you don't get duty-free. Everything else is duty-free. So that's in fact spurred a lot of the countries and a lot of the businesses, well, a lot of the businesses I should say in Fiji, to actually target Papua New Guinea. And the fact is that Fiji has a very broad capacity in terms of supplying of goods and services. Fiji also has, in recent times, allowed a completely fee-free access in terms of labor mobility into Fiji from other MSG countries. We are still waiting for that to happen in, for example, Papua New Guinea. There's enormous potential. As you know, there's enormous demand for tradespeople, skills people in the finance sector, in the mining sector. And Fiji has a very good base of personnel and people. Of course, I'll touch on that regarding the education schemes that have been offered. So that has opened up enormous potential for us. And I think FIBC should take advantage of that. And I'll again come back to that, because the advantage one has to take is whether your focus would be assisting large consolidated companies or consortium of companies like Fijian Holdings, or do you also provide support to individual entrepreneurs, whether it's Ben's Trading, whether it's Cakes 2000. And I think that's something that FIBC needs to look at in terms of its role in providing support. Do you actually provide the skill sets, the support, the management skill sets, the lack of that the President was talking about, and assisting them, or are you focusing primarily on the bigger businesses? And I think there's a lot of models that one can look at regarding that. So the MSG has enormous potential. It's good to have somebody like Sir Morgan here. And the Permanent Secretary of Industry and Trade is also here. He can read the MSG trade agreement back to front. But there are also other trade agreements within the Pacific, which I think that is not well known by businesses, whether it's Partaka, whether it's DSS, whether our accessibility into the Australian and New Zealand markets. The Australian and New Zealand markets still constitute about 36% of our overall trade. So there's still a lot of potential there. We have, for example, at the moment, a company based in Lautoka that's exporting on a very small scale water pipes and sewage pipes to Australia. They're broken into the Australian market. So there's obviously an appetite for those two countries to take goods and services from Fiji. And recently we've had approaches by the two larger countries, Australia and New Zealand, to further the talks regarding PESA and PESA Plus, which we'll be talking to them further on it. I'd like to go back, and I think we need to contextualize where we are today, and it leads on to some of the potentials that can be tapped into as far as indigenous businesses are concerned. I'd like to start off with the Constitution itself. The Constitution, for the first time, actually recognizes the unique culture, customs, tradition, and customary ownership of the indigenous peoples in Fiji. That is the Itāukei people and the Rotuman people. Now, apart from that recognition and the protection of it, what is very, very significant is that in the Bill of Rights, for the first time, you have the actual protection of the ownership, of customary ownership of Itāukei land, and of course Rotuman land. Now, approximately 91% of the land is owned by the individual landowning units. Now, it is significant, as I'll come back to that later. So that protection is there, and there cannot ever be now any permanent alienation of that land, which has happened in the recent past. The two examples that we've spoken about has been done around in Momi. Now, the other significant protection that's there is that for the first time again in the Constitution and in the Bill of Rights, you have a section that talks about that the landowners must get a fair and equitable return when they lease their lands. We've had a history in Fiji where what we call peppercorn rents have been paid to landowners. For example, in the 1950s and 60s, when vast tracts of land in Fiji was planted with mahogany, the rent was something like 5 shillings or 5p. So they were peppercorn rent. In fact, they were close to zero. So now you have a protection that it says that the rent that's paid by the tenant must be fair and equitable. So there cannot be any exploitation in terms of the renting of land. Section 30 talks about the right of landowners to a fair share of royalties for the extraction of minerals. That's again something that's been put in for the first time. It's never been done before. And as you know, the story in Vatakola and various other places where this exploitation is taken for a period of time, and land in fact has been alienated for 999 years. But there has been no return in terms of the royalties. Section 32 is critical because it talks about the right to economic participation. So every government, whether it's the Baini Marama government or a new government post-September 2014 or in 2025, must ensure that an individual citizen of this country has the right to choose work, trade, occupation, profession, or other means of livelihood. And the responsibility lies on the state itself to take all reasonable measures to ensure compliance with this particular provision of the Constitution. Things like right to access to reasonable access to transportation. Now, this means the inclusion of those people in the rural areas, in the isolated areas, in the maritime areas. It is a responsibility of the state, irrespective of whichever government it is a responsibility of the state to ensure that there is reasonable access to transportation. What that actually means is financial inclusion. It means people coming into the fold, so you're not out in the periphery. Of course, environmental rights, and the Constitution is quite specific on that the environment must be protected, not just for now, but for the future generations. And that is very critical as we develop different business models in vis-a-vis exploitation, as we've seen in some countries. What this does, ladies and gentlemen, I think it puts into the public space new ways of looking at the opportunities that are available to Fijians generally, but in particular to the Itāukei people. Let me give you an example. If land is an issue, is depoliticized, because you now have all the protections, it's guaranteed, it cannot be permanently alienated, that land must be seen as a resource for the building or exploitation of that asset to build the financial base of the landowners themselves. It is a very, very rare thing to see where a landowning unit has actually developed land for commercial, residential, tourism purposes themselves. The model has always been, let's lease it out to somebody and they are the ones who are making money in the end. So the value adding does not actually go to the landowner themselves. The value adding is done by somebody else. So this is the model. I mean, if you look at, for example, a place like Dubai, you cannot have freehold land there. It's all owned by the indigenous people. But everybody's clamoring to go into Dubai because there is a proper, transparent mechanism in terms of leasing lands. You do pay market rates, and you're able to then foster your business. So with the depoliticization of these types of issues, you're able to then use these assets as a means of commercial enterprise, as a means of improving the economic and financial base of the landowners themselves. The Reserve Bank of Fiji, and to put this into context, and this will help you in your discussions of the next 2 days, the Reserve Bank of Fiji has recently released some figures which is contrary to what the President has said. And let me give you the facts. The facts are this. There's been economic growth now for four consecutive years, which is above our historical growth. The economy has expanded by an estimated 3.6% in 2013, and 3% growth is projected for 2014. Inflation has stabilized after the rise in commodity prices in 2008-2009. It has averaged around 3% in the last 3 years, and the February 2014 rate is 0.2%, the lowest since April 2009. This low inflation rate obviously has had a number of factors affected, primarily the free education that was announced in the 2014 budget. Foreign reserve, which is a key indicator and an important factor for rating agencies when they assess a country rating, foreign reserves has been rising in the past 4 years and is currently around $1.8 billion, one of the highest ever recorded. Apart from these reserves, of course, the RBF has measured that there's an additional 700 million in reserves offshore, which is held by FNPF and government. Hence, total foreign reserves is approximately $2.5 billion. Domestic interest rates is the lowest. If you talk to any business person who knows about the market, they will tell you that domestic interest rates are at the lowest, one of the lowest it's ever been. The average commercial bank lending rate is around about 5.8%, and this obviously has supported credit growth. New bank lending in 2013 was $1.4 billion, 62% more than 2012, and almost double the amount that was in 2006. This, of course, is a significant sign of confidence by businesses and, of course, private individuals in the market. Investment to GDP ratio. Generally, all governments target a ratio of about 25%. It is estimated that we surpassed this target late last year and reached 28%. This year, the RBF estimates that the target will again surpass with a ratio of 26%. In our history, our country's history since independence, we only surpassed this target twice before this. In the in the 70s when we had Monosavu being built, and then in 92 to 96 when we had a couple of major hotel projects that were put in place. Now, what is really interesting is that in addition to this, private sector investment is now 15% of GDP. And primarily, half of this investment by the private sector is by Fijian investors, not foreign investors, but Fijian investors. Employment with 4 years of growth, we are seeing positive labor market conditions. RBF tracks this recruitment and estimates the new jobs by around about 9% in 2013. This is, of course, validated by the new FNPF membership. And one can check that quite easily. I suggest Fiji Times does that too. Debt to GDP. While the ratio has been rising in most advanced countries, with the rate exceeding 100% for some countries in Europe, Japan, and reaching over 90% in USA, our debt to GDP ratio has been declining, in fact. This is supported by the last IMF Article 4 mission a few years ago, which said that our debt levels, a few months ago I should say, our debt levels is sustainable. The ratio has declined to 49% from last year, which was around about 53%. If we exclude the sinking fund that we have offshore, the ratio is even lower at 46%. The average fiscal deficit under the Bainimarama government has been around about 2% of GDP. This is almost half the average of 4% deficit between 2000 and 2006. In addition, despite having a lower deficit, the mix of capital to operating expenditure is far superior than the previous government. The capex was around 32% last year and is around 34% this year, excluding the spending on education, which is of course human capital investment. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the reason why I've highlighted to you these facts, which you can all get from the RBF, is that when you have an economic environment that is very conducive to business investment, that is conducive to businesses having opportunities to borrow, but also borrow at a much lower price as far as the price of money is concerned, then obviously organizations such as FIBC need to take advantage of it very, very quickly in terms of supporting the membership. So what I'd like to do, I'm not here to give a lecture, but what I'm here to do is try and provide a contextualization in terms of the discussions, because I understand you're having a lot of panel discussions. Let me highlight very, very quickly some of the issues that, or some of the initiatives that have been put in place that can provide food for thought for your membership and indeed provide opportunities. Corporate tax has been reduced from 33% to 20%. If you list in the South Pacific Stock Exchange, which Fijian Holdings is listed, they now pay 10% corporate tax rate. Very, very significantly low. Now, why has that been done? Apart from the fact that companies like Fijian Holdings benefit from it, is that we want to encourage, there are many private businesses that are very large businesses. We want to encourage them to list. Now, if they are listed, then it provides opportunities for would-be entrepreneurs to actually buy shares in those businesses. That is very important. I love to see Sunbeam Transport listed so people in this room can buy shares. Love to see many other companies listed. That can be, if they are listed, they pay 10% corporate tax rate. It provides opportunities for the ordinary mums and dads and of course smaller businesses to buy into those businesses. Now, we have also, for example, increased the tax threshold. So small to medium enterprises, if they make less than 500,000 K a year, they don't pay any taxes. Similarly with VAT returns, they don't have to do that if it's less than $500,000. Now, because in terms of businesses, as Talatala also pointed out, giving the metaphor of a tree, the tree obviously needs to grow. You don't get a big tree overnight. It starts from a seed. In the same way, your business starts as a seed. You may start as a small enterprise. You may get medium, then you become bigger. And that's where the hand-holding comes in. Dr. Chida is here. He can tell you all about that, where you need to have holding of hands and how that holding of hands comes about in many different ways. But the reality is that we need to start off by growing that seed. And this is what we've been trying to focus on. This is why, for example, we have a national export strategy where we in fact give grants to businesses. Now, Ben's Trading, I think, is here in the room, or will be in the room at least tomorrow. Ben's there. They have received grants under the small and under the NES scheme. A couple of the other businesses have received grants under NES to help them leverage. They may already, for example, they may be exporting Dalo to New Zealand or Australia. If they want to buy a cooling system, they may have $50,000, it may cost them $200,000. We come up with the $150 as a grant, it's not a loan. So it's targeted approach in terms of providing assistance. And there's a very clear and transparent process regarding that. Buy Fijian, Fijian made. Very critical. We have just signed a deal, or we've initiative with Tapus, where they have in the corner of their shop, will be displaying authentic Fijian made handicraft. So the ladies up in Valley Road who make those potteries, the ladies who are extracting salt in Lomawai, we were in Ba on the weekend, who are making this wonderful handicraft from oyster shells, you know, the ones they use for pearls, that are discarded. These are business opportunities for them, but they're getting a higher price for it. As we know, as we've seen, that many such projects have failed, and the reason why they have failed is not because people don't necessarily have the acumen, they don't necessarily have the management skill sets. It's the connectivity with the market. It's the connectivity with the market. It's the right pricing. So you can make all this wonderful clay, jewelry, and handicraft, but if you're not connected to a shop, if you're not connected to a market, if you're not able to sell it online, your business will dwindle away. because nobody's buying it. And if you're expected to sell it for 5 cents as opposed to what you should be getting is $20, then obviously your business would dwindle away either, similarly. Exactly the same thing has been done with the mahogany industry. Landowners were being paid peppercorn rent. We have the largest planted mahogany forest in the world. In the world. Until recently, 70% of all the hardwood that was extracted by Fiji Hardwood Corporation was sold to one company, and Fijian mahogany went to Guatemala, where it was mixed with mahogany being extracted from other countries where it was indigenous, where it was illegally harvested, where the landowners weren't paid any rental or any poundage for it, any royalty for it. That's where our mahogany got mixed up in. We have now registered the Fiji pure mahogany in at least 19 different countries. When you have a chain of harvestation, when you have a clear linkages showing where it's harvested, who the owner is, where the money is going to, the value of your resource goes up exponentially. And that's what is actually happening. So these are some of the value-adding initiatives that we put in place that obviously is very, very critical. Things like infrastructure development. Roads are very, very important. I remember a few years ago when I was a prosecutor in DPP's office, there was somebody from Ra who was prosecuted for selling marijuana. And his argument was, yes, I'm selling it. He said, because when I grow marijuana, I don't actually have to take it down to the market. People actually come to me and buy the marijuana from me, and they pay me cash. I have a concrete house. I have Sky television. My kids have good school books. I have concrete footpath going to my toilet. I remember this quite clearly. It's an economic reality. So obviously to go down from his village down to the market would probably take you 2-3 hours, and a very heavy duty 4-wheel drive. So if you fix up the roads, if you give people electricity, if you give them access to water, people themselves are very enterprising. You are providing an enabler. And that's what any government's role should be. You need to provide the enablers for them to be able to take advantage of the situation. This is why for the first time this year, we have made education completely free. Let me put into context. Until last year, a primary school would get $30 a child. So if you're a school of 1,000 children, they would get $30,000. Today, a school with 1,000 students in primary school is getting $250,000. $250 a child. So the child who's in Yasawar, a school that's run by a committee in Yasawar Rara, or a child who's in Lau, or a child who's in Suva, is getting exactly the same amount of money. And previously, if you see the conditions of the schools in the rural areas, in the socially disadvantaged areas, it was pathetic. Run by committees. Most schools in Fiji are run by committees. So now we are creating a level playing field. Similarly with tertiary education. If tertiary education is available to everybody, then you will find that in Fiji in 5 to 7 years' time, we'll have a cadre of young people with tertiary qualifications. Whether some of them may go into trade, some of them may go and get degrees or diplomas, but Fiji as a country, as a nation, will have this vast resource, human resource, which can not only be used in Fiji, but of course sent to countries like Papua New Guinea, can be sent to countries like the other countries in the Pacific. So it all is a tie-in to ensure that we are building for the future. I think also what is critical in terms of empowerment is the equal distribution of land lease monies. You will find in any economic model, if you give me $1,000 or $10,000 and just only to me, and I have the right to spend that money. But if you take that $10,000 and give $100 each to everybody, 10 other people, or 100 other people, they will go and spend more as disposable income. They'll go and buy biscuits. They may go and paint their room. They may go and eat at Chicken Express. it has an enormous impact in the economy. It spurs the wheels. Because when they buy more Chicken Express runs out of chicken, they need to go and grow more chickens. So Rooster Poultry or Crest will say to the farmer, can you grow me more chickens? That essentially is one of the rationale behind that, apart from the equality issue, is to spur on the economic growth, because you're giving people more opportunity to have more carriage individually of their own economic well-being. I think I'd like to finish there because I actually have to leave very soon, MC. Coupled with that, I think what is very critical, two last points I'd like to make, is one of them is that we need to ensure that there is complete transparency in terms of business processes. One of the issues that we found, for example, I was, as you know, we've been doing these LTA consultations. We had a lady from one of the villages who'd applied for a rural taxi license. And she said, in my village, there is no rural base. But I applied, it was 18 months ago. But I know the person in the other village applied 3 months ago and they've already got the license. Now, what is the problem there? The problem there is that the actual processing of that application is not transparent. The processing of that application does not meet a strict criteria whereby processes need to be vetted against that criteria. So what is critical, and to give confidence to small businesses, to bigger businesses, that any government processes must clearly have a checklist. You tick the box, you meet the criteria, you get that license. Or you get that application, whatever it is that you're applying for, you will get it. If you don't tick it, if you don't meet the criteria, you don't get it. That increases the efficiencies. It increases confidence in the system. We found out it used to take about 6 to 9 months to register a company in Fiji. When we appointed, we brought it down to 44 days. In Singapore, it takes 15 minutes. They were very, very aggrieved by that because they told us they thought it was too long. They want to reduce it to 3 minutes. That's the target. We at the moment, as announced by the Prime Minister, embarked on a massive revamping of the government ITC. And within the next 2 months, you will find, for example, you can go online, apply with Investment Fiji, and get your application process within 24 hours with approvals from 5 different agencies, FERCA, RBF, Immigration, and 2 of the other agencies that I can't remember, and the Foreign Investment Certificate. So these are some of the processes that are being put in place, but as far as the smaller businesses are concerned, the target is to ensure that processes are very, very transparent. Last, but in terms of thought process for the FIBC, is in terms of providing assistance, we would love to see an organization like FIBC work together with Ministry of Industry and Trade and various other agencies that are providing support to the small to medium enterprises, and hold their hands and encourage them to become bigger entrepreneurs. Because there are a lot of very, very smart people out there. A lot of them are women, very, very smart, very, very clued on, and they're able to go to the next step if they're provided that assistance. And a lot of the time it is to do with mentoring. We have recently worked with the New Zealand volunteer agency, where they are now working with certain businesses to provide mentoring, how to develop your balance sheet, write your balance sheet, read your balance sheet, how to do your cash flow projections. These are the types of things that are very, very important. And from FIBC's perspective, I think in terms of the future, to see where support should be given. It should be given to small to medium entrepreneurs, should be given to larger companies like Fijian Holdings, and where does the twain meet? So ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the invitation this morning. I wish you a very, very fruitful discussions over the next 2 days, and I wish you a very good morning. Vinaka. Thank you.